Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway.
Good evening. I'm Garland Nixon standing in for George Galloway today. I know you looked and thought, gee, George, you've been out in the sun a little bit too long. Well, no, George is not here, and I'm fortunate enough to be standing in for him. The United States Supreme Court's made a number of critical rulings, and even though he won several important cases, Donald Trump is not necessarily a happy camper. Also, we got a great show for you. We have human rights lawyer Dan Kovalik, who was detained and robbed by the British government. And I say robbed because they took his electronic equipment, and we're going to talk about that. Also, Sam Husseini, this is also going to be great stuff. Sam Husseini, he's done some great work on government labs in Africa. He's tied government labs to a previous Ebola outbreak, and could they possibly be tied to the current one? And last but not least, we've got J Noh, who is an excellent scholar when it comes to Asia, and we're going to tie what's happening with the Iranian conflict to China. We're going to have these stories and more on the Mother of All Talkshows coming up.
Curious about our curriculum? Have something to say? Then call us now to join the debate on the Mother of All Talkshows, the only education you can get for free. George Galloway, the Mother of All Talkshows, with George Galloway. The world is our classroom, and you're welcome to sit in and join the seminar.
The court has ended President Trump's quest to guarantee the birthright citizenship for U.S.-born babies of undocumented immigrants and temporary visitors. For those of you who don't know about the history of this, there is some legitimacy to that argument, but there's a great constitutional stumbling block. Certainly, it has been well known amongst Americans that oftentimes people of significant economic means will come to the United States to have their children so that their children can get birthright citizenship, and then afterwards go back so that their children will be citizens of the U.S. and will have that particular privilege. And I mean, it is a reasonable discussion to try to figure out whether or not that's valid, but it certainly appears that the way that President Trump went about it, which was heavy-handed, which was what former presidents such as Dick Cheney and Bush, well, Vice President Dick Cheney and President George Bush called the Unitarian executive, meaning, massive power in the hands of the president. And Donald Trump has certainly used that particular method of governing, and in a lot of ways, it didn't go well through the Supreme Court. So is it dead? No, mostly dead, but not completely dead, because the U.S. Congress could still act on this. The U.S. Congress could still pass laws that would make changes to those particular laws. I think the stumbling block they would run into is that because it is a constitutional issue, it would probably take more than a simple majority. It may take 2/3 of a vote, and there could be some other restrictions. So I would argue that for the life of Donald Trump's presidency, which I would certainly argue ended February 28th when he attacked Iran, but the actual presidency, I think this goal is pretty much dead. I don't think he'll get it through Congress. So the birthright citizenship thing is dead. I think one of the interesting Supreme Court findings recently has to do with tariffs. And it's another way that the American people are going to, the working classes always get the shaft. And here's basically what we have. The president and his staff required tariffs for goods coming from other countries, significant amounts in some instances. And what these companies did, they had to pay the tariffs. Some of them were pretty significant amounts. And of course, they passed them on to the everyday working class person out here who had to buy their goods and or services, right? So they pay the extra tariff, let's say it's 20%, 50%, whatever the case may be, and the price gets passed on to you and I. Supreme Court comes along and says that's illegal, and the government is going to have to repay the corporations, the businesses, the amount of money that they expended for the tariffs. but they don't have to give it to the final end buyer, which means who wins? As always, it's the corporations. The Supreme Court says, hey, you've got to give money back to the corporations. Did the corporations lose money? No, they didn't. They paid the tariffs. They passed that on to the consumer. The consumer paid the tariffs. It's a pretty good deal. And now whatever percentage of tariffs they paid, they get the money back. And in the end, as always, the working class has to eat the mistake, if you'll call it a mistake. And I would argue this, the corporations probably aren't even angry at Trump. I mean, if you think about it, they're probably thrilled with Donald Trump right now. They're probably said, wow, we get a big bonus. And in fact, the way the way they count the numbers and gross domestic product, interestingly enough, if you think about it, the numbers that, which is, I think it's around $180 billion in tariffs that were collected. So that's $180 billion that will go back to the corporations, okay? And that will be counted as profit. So we paid an extra $180 billion. The corporations get that $180 billion back. They then count it as profit. And technically, Donald Trump can can argue the gross domestic product increased by $180 billion because look what the corporations made. It always kind of works out that way for us. There were a number of other things that happened. President Trump tried to fire a member of the a person on the board of the Federal Reserve, and actually there was two things going on. He fired someone from the Federal Reserve, and I've got notes on it here somewhere. Also, there was also a person who. Rebecca Slaughter, she was a member of the Federal Trade Commission, and President Trump didn't like her, I guess, because Democrats put her in. He said, I'm going to can her, and I'm going to get rid of somebody from the Federal Reserve. And interestingly enough, the Supreme Court ruled that he could actually fire Rebecca Slaughter, the member of the Federal Trade Commission, FTC, but they carved that. So they're like, no, you can't do that. You can't, you can only remove commissioners for inefficiency, neglect of duty, or malfeasance in office. But they said, forget that. You can fire her for anything, but you can't do it to a member of the Federal Reserve. Isn't that interesting? That they made a little carve out that you can fire anyone else for any reason you want, but not a member of the Federal Reserve. And I think we all know why that is. I think we all understand what the Federal Reserve really is. The Federal Reserve is not a government bank. It's not a government institution. It is run by private banking. It is, to some extent, the manner by which private banking institutions, Wall Street, et cetera, control our government. They control our money. They control our government. And in fact, something else you may need to know in case you weren't aware of this, President Trump has just anointed, it's a good word for it, a new person as the chair of the Federal Reserve. Interestingly enough, the guy that he anointed, I think his last name is Harsh or Warsh, W-A-R-S-H. You can look it up. But at any rate, he's not important. What's important is that his father-in-law is Ron Lauder of the Estee Lauder makeup fortune. Ron Lauder also happens to be the president of the World Jewish Congress. He was also one of the members of the Mega Group, which included the financial benefactors of Jeffrey Epstein. So we've got once again, whenever we reach into Washington, D.C. and shake around a little bit, a member of the Epstein class always falls out. A ruling member of the Epstein class always falls out. So, certainly the Federal Reserve is going to be protected because it's got the Epstein class's fingerprints from top to bottom. And of course, it's what allows Wall Street or the City of London to completely control the finances of this country. And again, the questions always have to be asked. How much power does President Donald Trump actually have? How much power does any president actually have? We've got some other things. The court induced a Republican-backed effort to lift limits on campaign financing. Here's the bottom line. I got to say this about this. When we talk about, there was other laws, other findings regarding Voting Rights Act. Right. And I do feel that these are legitimate issues, and certainly, more money in politics is not a good thing. But being the cynical person that I am, I have to pose another question, pose another issue here. And that is, we're talking about the process of how we vote. We're talking about the process of how they count the votes, of who can vote. All of those things are important, fair enough. But in the end, how important is the process? I tell you why. In the end, we vote for two people who argue about who loves Israel the most, who call each other anti-Semites, basically. In the end, we get Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. So I don't care how pristine the electoral process is, right? So when it comes down to it, it's rigged because the choice is, you're in the UK. Let's say you're in the UK and they've got a great electoral process, whatever and you get, what do? You get Liz Truss, you get Rishi Sunak, you get Keir Starmer, you get Bojo, you get Burnham, you get whoever, you get some iteration of the same person over and over again. Here we get, think about it. It was Obama and what's his name, and John McCain. You know, McCain was a little bit more of the knuckle dragging kind of neocon, where Obama was a refined guy and he had a beautiful family and he was very well spoken, a brilliant man, and he looked great and all in a suit, tall and slim, but he was a knuckle dragger when it came down to his foreign policy, invading, bombing, and murdering, and every Tuesday deciding what innocent people they were going to kill with drones. Then we can choose between Hillary and Trump. Again, Donald Trump is a so-called populist. And what have we found out that a populist does? For all of this talk about how we vote and whether or not our process is right, what does a populist do? To me, based on what I've learned from Donald Trump, here's what a populist does. He tells you what you want to hear until he gets in office. That's the only difference. Kamala said all of the things that we didn't want to hear. And Trump said all of these things we want to hear. No war, no bad things. We're going to think about the little guy and we're going to fix all of this stuff. He even talked about Glass-Steagall and instituting banking regulations. What the populist does now is tell you the things that you want to hear. And then when he or she gets in office, Georgia Maloney, when he or she gets in office, they work for the same people. They work for exactly the same people, and they're going to do what they're told. And at some point, people will realize that this so-called move of populism is just another game. So when you're sick and tired of hearing the same old things, you'll get rhetoric. The populist is going to borrow rhetoric from the left, borrow rhetoric from the right, borrow rhetoric wherever it needs to, because it's only rhetoric. It's kind of like the MOU. It's easy to get a deal. When it comes to the MOU, you're dealing with a narcissistic empire, or in the instances of a politician's narcissist. I always say this. It's easy to get a deal with a narcissist because they have no intent of keeping their word. And if they can put their signature on anything. The MOU was great. No problem. Trump, where will you sign? Tell me where to sign. He didn't care what was in it, because he had no intent of keeping his word. And when Donald Trump ran for office, or any of these other populists out there, they don't care what they have to say, because once they get in office, they're all going to work for the same people. And it's also, but we can argue about the process. We can argue about who can vote, whether there's mail-in ballots. The Supreme Court even made a finding on mail-in ballots. And what did we see recently in Kentucky? Thomas Massey ran. I believe there was like 10,800 mail-in ballots, and some schlep that nobody had ever heard of got like 10,500 of them. How's that? Well, they might as well gave them all of them. I mean, if you're going to rig it, why go halfway, go all the way? So I think at some point, the masses out here, the working class, we have to come to the conclusion where discussing the process is irrelevant, because when we get to the end and we got Joe Biden, Donald Trump, Keir Starmer, Merz, Macron, some other banking-owned, military-industrial complex-owned Zionist, and we got two of them, and you can choose between which one you want. Generally, in the United States, here's the way it works. You get one with a rainbow flag and one without a rainbow flag. They're all the same guy. You get to choose whether you get a rainbow flag or not. You're going to get a blue and white flag, that's for sure, but whether or not you get a rainbow flag is the option here. Do you want a warmonger and a Zionist with or without a rainbow flag? It's up to you. Like a sundae, do you want nuts? Do you want a cherry on top? Do you want a rainbow flag? Other than that, you're going to get the same thing for 4 years. So the Supreme Court made some irrelevant rulings about voting, so we can vote. We can decide how we choose the next warmongering Zionist. One other thing I'd like to touch on, and that is before we go, and I think it's important. We only got a few minutes. I think this is critical. I'm looking at the foreign policy of the EU, and it's suicidal. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, let's think of the end. Let's just think of the EU and NATO, their policy. We're going to go to war with Russia. Okay, that's your plan. Go to war with Russia by 2030. Okay. And let's just say, for the sake of argument, they are successful. They're already, I don't think they will be prepared by 2030 or any other time, but let's just run with this. Their policy is to prepare to go to war with Russia by 2030, which would mean that they'd like to win in a year. We're going to defeat Russia in a year. So let's follow this to its natural end. You get all your war stuff together. Hooray. You aim them all at Russia. Well, the question is, why do you have to take everything to the Russian border to fight Russia? I thought they were coming after you. Okay. You get to the Russian border. You then somehow defeat Russia, and you're marching on Moscow. Hooray! We've defeated Russia. We're marching on Moscow. Okay. So let's follow this to its natural end. At that point, what does Russia's nuclear deterrence policy say that Russia will do? You've gotten everything you want. You got your military together. You've defeated the evil Russians, and you're surrounded in Moscow, and you're taking them out. This is certainly a wishful thinking scenario for them. I don't think it'll happen. But what happens then? According to Russia's nuclear deterrence policy, they will then turn the entire European Union into black, shiny glass. Think about that. You have a political class that has a foreign policy that if it's successful, if they get what they want, every single person in Europe, and likely even on Earth, because of course that'll probably spread, but let's just say this, every person dies. Can you imagine that? I've got a policy. And you know what they'll say? It's a defensive state. This is a defensive organization. What are they defending? Is this kind of like that movie where some robot and an alien comes here and says, we're here to save the earth, and ultimately you find out it's by killing all human beings? It's not human beings he's here to save. He's here to save the earth from human beings. Is that what the EU and NATO are going to do? Europe's a great place. If only there weren't any people here, I think it would grow back in a couple 100,000 years. Pretty good. Once all the radiation, dissipated and what have you. I think we'd have a beautiful, beautiful continent here. Is that their plan? Apparently it is. Because if they are able to execute their plan perfectly, one thing is absolutely guaranteed, and that is there will be, and I got to add this, their plan is against the preeminent nuclear power on Earth. It's not like they're attacking Iceland. I would say it was wrong if they were attacking Iceland. I got nothing against people in Iceland. People in Iceland are nice. They got a lot of seals and all kinds of things in Iceland. But this ain't Iceland. This is the preeminent nuclear power on Earth. And there seems to be nobody at NATO or the EU, no person kind of like Garland, who's in the back of the room, who at some point during this policy discussion sticks their hand up in the air. Excuse me, I've got a question. Yes, Mr. Nixon in the back of the room. Don't you think we'll probably get nuked and all die? Is nobody asking that question? Apparently not. But that's what the Mother of All Talkshows is about. We are here to ask those kinds of questions. We are here. The obvious questions, I think, that have to be asked. And we got some great guests today coming on. We got Daniel Kovalik. We got J Noh. We've got, oh my gosh, we got lots of great people, and we're going to have another fantastic show. Even though George isn't here, I'm going to do my best to stand in for him. My name's Garland Nixon, standing in for George Galloway. We'll be right back.
The talk shows this morning are treating the defeat of Dan Goldman as if some jack-booted fascist had kicked him out of his congressional office. It was a Jew that beat him. One Jew beat another Jew. Goldman was the Jew that supports Netanyahu, and his challenger and the man who defeated him is also Jewish. but completely opposes the genocide in Gaza. I say sing hallelujah. The victory of that kind of Jewish insurgent is precisely what we have been waiting for. What the world needs now is the Jewish people themselves to step forward and start proving all over again, as they did in centuries of European and North American struggles, that they are indeed an avant-garde people, that they are in the avant-garde of humanity, for justice, for freedom and liberty, rather than apartheid, slavery and genocide. I myself want to take my hat off to Mayor Mamdani and to ask my colleagues no longer to play that jingle that basically insults him. I was wrong about Mayor Mamdani. He's doing a great job, and he is making popular ideas that America needs, and which I pray they will continue to reach for.
You are listening to the Mother of All Talk Shows with George Galloway.
Hello, my name's Garland Nixon. I'm standing in for the one and only George Galloway. And our poll today is Israel deliberately targeting Palestinian children? Yes, no, yes or no? Telegram, so far we've got, it looks like 503 votes. We got 99 yeses and 1 no. Well, I'm gonna have to learn how to count a little bit better. Telegram, X, we've got 90 yeses and 10 no's. It looks like YouTube. We've got YouTube, 95 yeses and 5 no's. YouTube Stream, 98 to 2, and Patreon, we've got, it looks like 100 yeses and 0 no's. So we've got a lot of different, this is the percentage. I'm saying like 90 and 1, excuse me. Still, these aren't numbers. It's not 99 yeses and 1 no. Out of 503 votes, 99% yeses and 1% no. So I've got it all straight here. I finally got this thing figured out. It's a little bit complicated for a guy like me, but I finally got this thing straight. All right. Bottom line is, I think most people are pretty familiar with the situation, and it seems fairly obvious that Israel is targeting Palestinian children. All right, U.S., we got open nines, +1 844-944-3344. These are the phone lines. UK, 08-081-965522, and our worldwide number, 0044-203-966. 2625. I am looking forward to your calls, and I will get things straight as far as the percentages next time. So I think we got the poll straight. Go to Telegram, X, YouTube, comments, YouTube stream, and Patreon, and you can vote today, be a part of it. Is Israel deliberately targeting Palestinian children? And I think these polls are important. I think they're important because a lot of people watch the Mother of All Talk shows. A lot of people listen to the Mother of All Talk shows. And there are a lot of people out there who watch mainstream media, and they wonder, how do people feel? If you watch mainstream media, you'll think that everyone is in favor of the things that are that the Israelis and the Zionists are doing, that nobody agrees with you, that nobody understands the way you see these things. And I think these polls are important because it's important for people to know that we are in the majority, that we're not in the minority, that there is a moral a component to politics, and that there are a lot of people like us who feel like we're on the right side of that, and we're in the majority, and we're in the majority of the world. So go to Telegram and X and all of that stuff right now, be a part of the poll, and let everybody know that you're in agreement with them and that we're right. All right, next, we got a guy by the name of Daniel Kovalik. He's a professor, he's a lawyer, he's an author, and he's a guy who's been nabbed, grabbed, arrested, and detained by the UK authorities. Apparently, he came into, I guess it was Heathrow here in the last couple days. He was here to visit friends and family. He was here for, just life things. He wasn't here to do any work or any actions on behalf of, Israel or anyone else. But apparently, Dan was detained, and his electronics were taken, and we're standing by. Hopefully we'll have Daniel Kovalik on in a few short moments. And I think that looks like Dan Kovalik. Dan, welcome to the Mother of All Talkshows. Yeah, Dan's a great guy. He's been a good friend.
I really appreciate it.
Excellent. Dan's a great guy. He's a good friend. Dan, are you still representing the president of Colombia as an attorney?
Yes, I am. I'm very proudly doing so. I'm trying to get him off this OFAC, blacklist that the U.S. keeps. That's my big preoccupation these days, is helping him with that.
Wonderful. Well, Dan, the last time I visited Moscow, Russia, with me, Scott Ritter and I, and we got to, customs, and they let everybody through except us, and they sat us on the side, and Scott and I looked and we're like, oh, we're not in any trouble. And a few minutes later, we saw all of these customs guys come out in uniform, do this. And Scott walks over and they all said, Scott Ritter, can we take a picture? Can we take pictures with you? Right. And they're like, hey, we know you, Garland Nixon. We see you on with Scott Ritter. I'm like, yeah, I'm the other guy that's with Scott Ritter, right? Well, I understand you had a similar experience in the UK, but not quite the same. If you could relate to our audience, your similar experience in the UK here in the last few days.
Yes, actually, yes. I actually was flying in, not into London Heathrow. I was flying into John Lennon International Airport in Liverpool.
Okay.
And which was the last place I was expecting this to happen. I showed my passport. At first, the guy was, friendly, welcomed me. But then when he scanned it, his, demeanor changed, and he lifted the passport behind his head and gave it to some security officials that were waiting there. Clearly, they were waiting there for me. And they took me back, and as you noted, they told me I was being detained under UK anti-terrorism laws. And they said, we can take your electronics, your phone, your computer. We're going to do that. We're also going to fingerprint you, take a DNA swab, which they did. They did all those things. They took photos of me, and they interrogated me. All in all, I was there for about 2.5 hours.
Wow. Now, you are, as many people know, an international human rights lawyer of great note. Their legal argument, number one, the terrorism laws, and number one, under international law, and you certainly were in compliance with all laws and regulations that between the United States and the UK. What are your thoughts on the legality of what they did and the pretense that they used to both detain you and to basically steal your personal items?
Well, I believe that what they did was in violation of international law norms. In terms of domestic UK law, the problem is that they have very broad anti-terrorism laws, as the US does as well, which give them incredible latitude to detain, arrest people, and take their property. So probably under UK law, for the most part, they probably had the legal right to do it. Though I think there is one big issue. I did raise an objection that I'm a lawyer that has information subject to attorney-client privilege and attorney work product on my devices, but they still took them to be copied. So there may be a big issue there. But aside from that, again, people do need to know that under these anti-terrorism laws, they have incredible latitude, and especially at the border areas. I'm not an expert in British law when it comes to that, but I know in the United States, until you cross, immigration and customs, even in an airport, right? You've flown into a domestic airport, right? You might have flown into Chicago, right in the middle of the country. And, but until you get through those doors back in the terminal, you are not considered to have entered yet the United States of America. You do not have full constitutional rights. And it seems that that's probably true in Great Britain as well. So what countries like Britain and the U.S. and others are doing, they're using the border areas as a means to do things to people like myself that they couldn't otherwise do outside them, right, within the border areas. So they don't need otherwise they would need a warrant to take my stuff, right, and to search my stuff. They would need a warrant for my arrest to interrogate me in those sorts of ways. But at the border areas, they can dispense with those niceties.
You know, what you're saying is important. And as you know, my background as a law enforcement official, I worked with years ago. Well, this was before all of this terrorism stuff, but this was I worked with the border officials, and one of the things that I found out through all of my training was that if you are somewhere, let's say you're inside the United States, but you're close to the border, and they believe you just came across the border. Let's say you're in a boat, and you're in a boat that has the capacity to go out into the open sea, right? You're in the Chesapeake Bay, but you've got a 50-foot sailboat you could easily sail. What they can argue is this. You could be going or coming from another country. Or you could be coming right in from another country. So therefore, your Fourth Amendment freedom from unreasonable search and seizure law rights don't apply. So basically, around the border, a lot of people don't understand that around the borders of the United States, it's very sketchy as to whether you have Fourth Amendment freedom of search and seizure, freedom from unreasonable search and seizure, because they will argue, well, you just came in, you could have a plant, an animal, drugs, whatever the case may be, that's not allowed here. And oftentimes people coming across the border will think, well, they'll say, we'd like to search your car or your boat or whatever the case may be. You don't have the options of saying no. And it certainly appears that now, I don't think there's any evidence that a guy like Dan Kovalik, who is literally a human rights attorney, is a terrorist. But it seems now that these things are being used as a ruse for what seems to me more than anything else, harassment. Do you think this was about harassment and setting the precedent that other people will be afraid, or was it more about getting down? What do you think about this, Dan?
I don't know for sure. I certainly think harassment is certainly one of the goals. I think the goal, though, was to get my electronics. I think they do want to search my contacts, including maybe my contacts with Gustavo Petro, my client, the president of Colombia, which, again, that should be subject to work product and attorney-client privilege. I think that, we're entering more repressive times. I mean, we're seeing that in Great Britain, in the United States, in Germany, particularly against Palestinian rights activists, which I am one of those as well. And as the war expands, and you mentioned at the top of your program, you mentioned NATO's, probably impending war against Russia. As the war expands in those types of ways, and I think it will, sadly, you will see more repression, because these are going to be very unpopular wars. The war with Iran is very unpopular, right? And combined with that, you're going to see a lot of economic dislocation, economic crises. And so the governments are trying to get ahead of that. They're going to start cracking down on people. At first, more outspoken dissidents and activists and organizers, and then, kind of move on from there. But I think that's what's happening. That's what you're seeing. And so you see people like George Galloway, who was treated exactly like I was, right? And Kit Clarenberg. There's a number of people. By the way, I know almost all those people. Maybe that says a lot about me and about them. But, you're going to see more of that, sadly.
I also think recently, again, while I have my issues with the Democratic Socialists and their advocacy for imperialism on all too many instances. I think that we heard some noise from President Trump regarding some of the Democratic Socialists that won in New York, basically saying, watch out. There's a well, we're going to do war on these communists. And I think that there are people who, many of us in the alternative media sphere who advocate at least for some level of socialist type policies for the working class, advocate for organized labor, things of that nature. And I think there's also the possibility that people who advocate for some of these other humanity-based political policies could also be facing repression as a result of that. I think that's something that may also be growing.
Yeah, no, I agree. As they see their political power slipping away, economic power slipping away, they will continue to be more repressive. I mean, and again, these anti-terrorism laws are a perfect tool for them because they're written so broadly that pretty much anyone involved politically could be accused of this. And you see in the U.S., for example, they just arrested one guy, just got 30 years in jail for transporting a box of anti-ICE propaganda. One would have thought that would be protected by the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Maybe it will be on appeal. Maybe I think the person has a good appeal, but for the moment, he's been convicted and given 30 years in prison. I mean, this is insane, but this is where we're at the moment.
Yes, in fact, there was recently some people in England, in the UK, who were given, I believe, I forgot what they were involved in, but there were some people in Great Britain who were basically sentenced to very long sentences for something similar. I know there was a Dr. Ranjit Brar, someone who I've seen on many instances on the Mother of All Talkshows, who was basically, drummed out of his job at the NHS again, advocating on behalf of people who are victims of Zionism right now. And that's something that, also they're very touchy about. Again, a subject that as an international human rights advocate, something that you've worked on. So it looks like that you pretty much, as they say, checked all the boxes to infuriate the imperialists, Dan.
Yeah, it seems like it. And, the interrogation did not kind of reveal what they were really concerned about because they asked me about everything. Russia, China, Iran, Palestine, so, but it's true. I probably do check. I'm at least a triple threat, I would think. So.
Yes, as they say in sports, right? They're going to treat you like the Iranian soccer team, for goodness sake. I think when you come back, instead of being able to stay in Pittsburgh, you'll be able to be at Pittsburgh during the day, and you'll have to sleep in Tijuana every night. Exactly. Let me ask you this. I do want to ask you this. We have a few minutes left. The MOU and what's happening. I know you've been to Iran. I know you've been, throughout to, Syria, and you've done a lot of work in West Asia and the Middle East. And your thoughts on the state of affairs with the MOU that appears that it wasn't worth that it isn't worth the electronic paper that it wasn't written on.
Yes, well, I think that is pretty clearly true. I mean, we see time and again, particularly with Iran, that all the agreements that the U.S. and Israel make with Iran are broken at some point by the U.S. or Israel. And Iran knows that. They're not naive. They know that the war will continue, unfortunately. I think it's only a matter of time. Trump needed a pause in the war because economically he knows it's very dangerous to the U.S. economy and therefore to his political, career. I think both Israel and the U.S. needed a pause to rebuild munitions and weapons, which they expended a lot on in that war. But it's a pause. I don't think it's an end. As Winston Churchill once said regarding World War II, it's not the beginning of the end, but the end of the beginning.
Yeah, I agree. And, the other issue I think that is important, and I'd like to throw it at you, and that is, the issue of the economic fallout. Right. There were many who believe that, no, the Trump will never take it. But so far, he'll end this thing because the economic fallout will be too, difficult politically for him. And, the people will be hurt. And I always bring up a quote from Tony Blinken's 1987 book, right? Ally versus Ally, about the Siberian pipeline crisis. I would advise people to read that. It's like the manifesto of a serial killer. If you want to understand Nord Stream being blown up and the relationship how the neocons view the relationship between Europe and Russia, that's a good book. But here's one of the things a quote from the book. And he was speaking of the people that he is aligned with. From Tony Blinken's book, 87. For a number of influential policymakers, the time seemed opportune to engage the Soviet Union in a round of economic warfare. Here's the important part. Regardless of the price that might have to be paid by the economies of Western Europe and the American business community. What Tony Blinken was saying back then is the way the neocons see things. Look, we don't care about the working class. When he says the economies of Western Europe, he's talking about us. Because the ruling elite and the elite class are going to drive down the price of everything, and then they're going to buy it for pennies on a dollar anyway. We're the ones that are going to be wandering around the street like we're in the middle of some kind of a zombie apocalypse, eating each other, right? Starving or struggling. So if you read it, then they let you, the political class, the ruling class, let us know. We don't care about your economies. We don't care if you starve. If they'll throw us all to the front lines to die in a war or get nuked, they certainly don't care if we lose our jobs and we're hungry, Dan.
Yeah, well, Trump himself said that. He said he doesn't care about oil prices, consumer goods prices, the economy, the people's economy, right? There's two economies. There's the economy for the rest of us, and then there's the economy for the super rich. And they're going to get super rich no matter what happens, as you say. They'll find a way to keep accumulating wealth, and they will use chaos and war to accumulate that wealth, and we will suffer. That's how this all works.
Yeah, I do think, Dan, that we are in a different world than they're accustomed to. I think that there is an irony here and a paradox in that they want to militarily dominate Russia and China and Iran and the world, and in using neoliberalism to hollow out our educational system, to hollow out our industrial system. Meanwhile, the Russias and Chinas of the world and the Irans of the world were educating their people. They were expanding their industrial system. And now they are not in a position physically, though they want to fight them, though they want to physically dominate them, they now find that because of neoliberalism hollowing out the society, they don't actually have the physical capacity to dominate what they called the third world back then, the global south anymore.
To some extent, though, look what's happening in Cuba and Venezuela. I mean, Ecuador, Honduras. I mean, the U.S. has been able to exert its will in those places to a large extent. I mean, it's still, you're right, it's a waning empire, but it's still a very powerful empire. But as you say, they are hollowing out the infrastructures even in their own countries. I heard a great quote the other day. In the U.S., there's always been homeless living under bridges, but now they don't even fix the bridges.
Exactly. It's kind of sad. Oh, my gosh. Let me tell you something. I don't know about Pittsburgh. Right around Baltimore, look at these roads. You know what I mean? I mean, you're riding around thinking, if I hit a pothole big enough, I mean, my whole car is going to go in it, or it's just going to destroy the suspension of the suspension system of my car. The roads are absolutely atrocious.
Yeah.
The roads look like right after a bad winter when there's potholes and except now they don't fix them. I think they can't.
No, it's true. I live off of Fifth Avenue in Pittsburgh. Every Fifth Avenue in any city is a major thoroughfare, and that's true of Pittsburgh. It has been under reconstruction for 7 years. And it is still impassable. And Pittsburgh, you may be interested to know, has more bridges than any city on earth, even more than Venice, about 400.
Wow. And
100 of those bridges are in emergency need of repair. And we've had at least 2 of them just collapse. So again, that's America.
Well, we've got to add another $700 billion, I think it is, to the Pentagon budget, Dan. So we don't really have, we don't have money for food and education and infrastructure because we've got wars we've got to fight. In fact, Trump said that. Trump said the government's not here for all of that stuff. We're here for it. Yeah.
That's right. You're going to have to eat, you got to give go down to one or two. Yeah. Go down to 1 or 2 meals a day so we can bomb Iran. That's how it goes.
Dan Kovalik, thanks a lot. And hey, where can people find you? Do you have a Substack or anything like that?
I do. You can find me on Substack. You can find me on Twitter at Daniel M. Kovalik. And you can find my books at various places, including my big publisher, SkyhorsePublishing.com. And I thank you all.
And Dan, sitting right behind me, there's, what do you know? Look at this.
Look at you.
The case for Palestine, why it matters and why you should care. Dan Kovalik, forward by George Galloway.
Oh, wow. There you go. Gorgeous George. That's great. That's great.
Yes. How appropriate. Well, keep up the good work, Nan. My name's Garland Nixon, and I'm standing in for the great, the one and only George Galloway. We'll be right back. We're going to be taking your calls and reading your comments next. You're listening to the Mother of All Talk Shows.
I never like the formulation. They used to say it in relation to Russia, good czar, bad advisors. That the leader could be given some ability to act as he would like to act, not hemmed in by malign forces, then everything would be better. The truth is, we don't know for sure, but Donald Trump gives me all the reasons I need to believe that he is running the show. He's running it in an extraordinary, contradictory and haphazard way, reckless way. He's running it in a way which faces multiple directions at the same time. But all the while, he's making stock trades. He's manipulating the stock markets. He's definitely a billionaire now. If he wasn't when he began, if he was when he began, he's a double billionaire already. His 21-year-old son, Burnham, is by now worth hundreds of millions of dollars from insider trading. He is able to move the American state machine and its military wherever he points it. They were outraging the people of Venezuela with military drills right in the middle of Caracas, the capital of a sovereign country and once an anti-imperialist country. They are moving naval assets in the direction of Cuba. He is picking his adversaries, and with remarkable determination. He never lets one go. Just when you thought he's forgotten about one theater, there he is back like a dog returning to its vomit. So I'm not ready to cut him that slack by implying that it's somebody else's fault. This is on Trump. The buck stops with him, and the bucks are flowing into him.
You are listening to the Mother of All Talk Shows with George Galloway.
This is the Mother of All Talk Shows. I'm Garland Nixon, standing in for George tonight. George will be back on Sundays on YouTube. Scan the QR code now and leave a comment on the YouTube stream. Keep it clean, and we'll read it out on the air. U.S., call 1-844-944-3344. U.K., call 08081-965522. And the worldwide number is 0044-203-966-2625. All right. Khan Kazin says, thank you, Garland, for hosting the show on behalf of Mr. Galloway. Fix-In Man says, Britain is barring journalists who are critical of Israel from entering. Colin J58, Dan, try flying into Dublin, then get a bus to Belfast, then get the ferry to Scotland, a well-used route. I'll remember that. If I'm trying to sneak into England, why do I feel like I should like come in late on like a raft with an all-black outfit on and swim the shore or something? Like that's the only way I'll get in safely. David Green once says, the shame I feel for my UK these days is bottomless, along with the moral depravity of the people who run the UK and the US too. It's a political relay race, says Bob Cosmic. Each leader takes the baton from their predecessor and run their leg of the race. Faces change, but the agenda remains the same. Line one, we're going to Crya in Florida. Who wants to talk about political persecution? Crya in Florida, what's happening?
Hi, Garland. Thank you so much for taking my call. I love to see you at George's show. Yeah, I just want to speak about in my view, the real problem here is how the legal system is completely entangled with the financial system. And what a lot of people don't realize is that there's multiple jurisdictions within the legal, and the legal system is one of them. So starting 1933, everything changed. They literally switched jurisdiction from equity to what they call at law, and that's when they started creating all these statutes and codes, and they brought, and people are, and they making people operate under maritime law that strips people out of their rights. So that's how, for example, if you go and register, but just by the mere fact of registering, you literally give away your rights to being even an American. So now you're just a voter. You're not even considered an American. They switched jurisdiction without people's knowledge. And with that, with all these registrations that people, if you notice, everything has to be registered, they're claiming all those. They're creating derivatives and assets and financial instruments that they're benefiting from. And people don't realize all of this. They're operating in a jurisdiction that strips people.
Well, Crya, let me throw this at you real quick. You know, one of the issues that I've always discussed is the issue of rule of law or arbitrary application of the law, right? Meaning, even when we talk about laws, for instance, we talk about the Constitution. However, if you look at presidents, they violate the Constitution routinely, and they're supposed to be held accountable by some kind of a checks and balances system that doesn't check or balance. So Donald Trump says, hey, I can start a war anytime I want to. George Bush says that, whatever. Either Congress, rather than checking them, they give them they don't check them. They give them a blank check to do it anytime they want to. And now that Donald Trump has said, you know, I started a war in violation of the Constitution. And then he says, oh, that's right. He literally said, oh, yeah, that's right. I can't call it a war. In other words, if he says it's not a war, he's not violating the Constitution. So even though what you're saying is valid about the laws and the way they write laws, it is my belief, and I'll get your thoughts on this, that it doesn't matter what the laws say, because we don't get a rule of law. We get arbitrary application of law. They could write a blank book the way they arbitrarily apply the rules and the laws. Now they're going to do whatever they want, and they don't even really seem to care what the rule books, the Constitution or the law say anymore. If I could get a quick thought on that from you.
I totally agree with you, and the reason for that is because the law has a totally different jurisdiction. It wasn't that way pre-1933, and even at the law books, everything I'm saying is on the record. The law books pre-1933 are completely different than the law than afterwards. That's when they started introducing a different jurisdiction, and that's the problem.
I hate to cut you. Yes, I hate to cut you off, Crya, but we've got some other callers and we've only got a minute or two to get to them. But yes, you made some great points. Thank you very much. Certainly appreciate it. That's Crya in Florida talking about political prosecution and a little bit about the law. Moats donors, a big thank you to some of tonight's top donors, supporters who've backed the program through the Moats.tv website. Bruce Sabatino, David Hudson, Susan Avery, Kevin John McKee, and Nassim Kadri. To support the show, visit moats.tv and click the Donate Now button anywhere on the site. Give whatever you can afford in any currency you like. One-off donations are always welcome, while recurring support helps keep the program independent, strong, and on air week after week. Remember, in the business world, we call it RMR, which means recurring monthly revenue. And a company that gets recurring monthly revenue is always much more powerful and much more valuable. I don't know if that's necessarily a good thing, but it is when it comes to Moats TV. So even if you can, which would you be better off, giving $20? I'm just throwing a number. Well, let's make it up. Giving $2,000 or giving $100 a month for a long time. The recurring monthly revenue would always be better, and it's easier on you. So for those of you who can't afford it, give what you can, but don't forget, it's critical. You'd be better off to do a little bit less and to put it as monthly. It's easier on you, and you're a part of you're going to be a part of the Moats team. And of course, it's really good to keep this good work going. All right. I think we got another caller. Let's go to Oklahoma. May wants to talk about the schools in Palestine. May, how you doing?
Hey, Garland. I'm so happy to get to talk to you. I'm a George Galloway family fangirl. And one time I actually got to ask Dr. Morandi a question, and now I get to talk to you. I'm so excited. The main reason I called is I read an article about this Swedish billionaire who's wanting to donate $75 million to build schools in Gaza, including trauma centers and playgrounds. And I'm just curious. I don't know if you've heard about this, but I'm wondering where he thinks he's going to build them. Is he just going to get Israel to let him take his bulldozers in there and build some schools, or if he's going to build them on pedestals or what? And so I wanted your opinion about that. And I also want to ask you, that looks like a Duran hat you've got on. I have one similar to it, so I thought I'd ask if that was a Duran hat, because I know you're part of that big family. And so I just wanted to tell you, Garland, I really enjoy you. You are very sane. I absolutely adore Scott Ritter, and but you and Scott are a little different in the sense that Scott is so amazingly passionate, and you are a little bit more balanced, even though you're very committed. So,
well, thank you very much. Yeah. You still there, May? Maybe not.
And
okay.
I'll just appreciate the time you gave me.
Thank you very much. Certainly appreciate it. Yes. Well, the business about schools, here's the thing about it. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, they were able to build, hundreds of schools all over Gaza. Who'd go to them? Israel's killing all the children. The first issue, I agree with you, that it would be a good thing if they were built. I think it's a sad state of affairs that that people have to say, I'm going to donate money to build schools, while the governments of Europe, of the EU and the US, the only thing we can donate is bombs. The only thing we donate the things to blow up the schools. We donate the stuff to kill the children. We help with the targeting to blow the schools up, the murdering of the children who wouldn't otherwise be going to the schools. So the schools will be empty at the rate things are going, because the Americans and the Europeans and all the traditional colonial and imperial powers are teaming up with the Israelis to make sure that there's nobody alive. In fact, as we talked about earlier in the show, recent information has come out. I believe even the BBC had to report, or Reuters, one of them, I'm not sure which one, but some of them had to report that the Israelis are deliberately targeting children. Again, there were people saying that that's good, that it was reported by some of the mainstream media. My argument is, and they can also report that fire is hot and ice is wet. Ice is cold. We all know what's going on with Israel. We all know the barbarity of the Israeli policies towards not just the Gazans, but certainly the Gazans and everyone around them. They're trying to do the same thing to Lebanon. So I think the good thing is that we all will continue to work against these policies. We'll continue to work on behalf of peace. We'll continue to work on behalf of justice for the people in West Asia and elsewhere. And we'll be back in a moment. My name's Garland Nixon. You're listening to the Mother of All Talk Shows. I'm standing in for the great George Galloway. Next, coming up with an independent journalist, Sam Husseini, who's done a lot of work on the issues in West Asia, the issues of Gaza and the Palestinians. And in particular, he's done a lot of work on COVID and Ebola, which is rearing its ugly head again. And I think he's going to have some information that you'll find interesting. We'll be right back.
Let's go to Paul in North Dakota on the attack in Ireland. Paul, welcome.
I have a difference with you, George. It's regarding the events in Ireland. Now, you have been an adamant supporter of, I'll call it the wholesale invasion of England by Mohammedans and others. And it doesn't work, George. And I'll use this analogy, is not perfect, but if you have a zoo, and I'm not in support of zoos, you don't take hyenas and mix them with koalas. You don't take snakes and mix them with rabbits. You're just asking for troubles. Now, if you bring in individuals from different backgrounds,
they're all. Let me stop your fascist rant right there, dead in its tracks. Hyenas and impalas are different species. Humans are all one species. People of another nationality to a hyena. Because I'll remind you, Mr. North Dakota, you're only in North Dakota because you arrived as a settler and massacred the original people of North Dakota. You racist fink. My grandparents came to Britain from Ireland, not to make Britain poorer, not to make themselves poorer, not to live on benefits. For benefits, there were none. They came from Ireland to Scotland so that they could work from 6 in the morning till 6 at night for 10 shillings and 9 pence. The people who are in our country have come here to make a better life for themselves and their families. A bit like how your forefathers did in North Dakota. Now piss off. You're not welcome. And I don't want you listening to this show any longer. Consider yourself banned.
You are listening to the Mother of All Talk Shows with George Galloway.
Oh, I think I found my way around here. Is Israel deliberately targeting Palestinian children? That is the poll of the day. Telegram, 99% say yes, 1% say no. Where did that 1% come from? How about X? 90% says yes and 10% say no. YouTube, 95 to 5. YouTube Stream says 98% to 2. And Patreon, the people on Patreon really know what's going on. A lot of wise people on Patreon. What do they say? Is Israel deliberately targeting Palestinian children? Patreon, 100% says yes. Wise people on Patreon. We're now going to go to an independent journalist who's done a lot of work, again, on Gaza and on the issue of Zionism. But for the purposes of this particular show, we're going to talk about Ebola and a little bit about COVID. Sam Husseini. Sam, welcome back. I haven't talked to you in a while, but it's always a pleasure. And I admire the fantastic work that you do.
Good to be with you. I wasn't sure what our subject would be today, but I'm prepared whichever way you want to take it.
Well, you know, you're a man of many talents and great knowledge. So let's talk about this. So Sam has a great Substack that I certainly am a member of. A lot of good articles there, a lot of good stories. And he had this great article. And the reason I brought it up now, I'm looking and there's Ebola. Will there be an Ebola outbreak? Ebola's everywhere. It's going to get us all. And I remembered, he had this really interesting article. Did West Africa's Ebola outbreak of 2014 have a lab origin and critical COVID connections? Africans who charged that the outbreak had lab origin were dismissed. Scientists they accused were the loudest in dismissing the possibility of a lab origin for COVID. Were the Africans right all along? You had a number of articles that you wrote. I think you had another one, if I'm not mistaken, on the origin of the Ebola outbreak. But there was a lot of very significant evidence to show that the last Ebola outbreak, at least, came from a U.S. lab. Sam.
That's correct. Ebola is endemic to Central Africa, the Congo. That's where the current outbreak is. But there was a large outbreak in 2014 in West Africa, some 1,000 miles away. At the time, some Africans were noting that there was a U.S. lab facility called the Viral Hemorrhagic Fever Consortium, run by two scientists, one from Tulane, Robert Gary, and one from Scripps Research, Christian Anderson, and that they those labs that they were in charge of included such notable corporations as Metabiota, and others. All those names might ring a bell with people. Metabiota is tied to Hunter Biden and the labs in the Ukraine, and Christian Anderson and Robert Gary were the authors of one of the major papers after COVID, claiming that COVID could not have possibly had lab origins. So what you see is a small clique of very financially connected so-called scientists that are doing this dangerous so-called gain-of-function lab work, that is, lab work that makes pathogens either more deadly or more easily transmissible, and they basically cover up for each other. So when COVID came out, if you look at some of the emails that have been disclosed as a result of Freedom of Information Act requests from U.S. Right to Know regarding what the positions of those scientists early on, you had Christian Anderson and Robert Gary effectively saying, we think that this could have come out of a lab. You had Fauci and Jamie Farrar, who is head of a major foundation funded by pharmaceutical interests in Britain, and he's now the chief scientist of the WHO, leaning on them to change that. And at one point, Jamie Farrar basically says, well, if we are going to look at COVID as having lab origins, then we got to look at other past outbreaks. And I believe that this was his way of telegraphing to Gary and Anderson that if you don't play ball here in terms of COVID origins and say that it didn't have lab origins, then we're going to have to revisit the 2014 outbreak that you may well have been culpable in. So this is basically an aspect of biowarfare. If you look back on all of this stuff, that is dangerous lab work, it really got juiced up when? After 9/11 with the anthrax attacks. The anthrax attacks that followed 9/11, if people remember, they initially tried to pin it was a false flag operation. It was a false flag bioweapons attack on the U.S. Congress. That is, somebody wrote letters saying, death to America, death to Israel, praise be to Allah, and sent it to members of Congress and prominent members of the U.S. media. Several people were killed, mostly like postal workers, complete collateral damage. They were sent to members of Congress who were the most resistant to the draconian aspects that the Cheney-Bush White House was trying to ram through with the Patriot Act. Some of the Leahy and some other members of Congress who were at least asking some questions during that period. And after that, Fauci juiced up all of the funding to this dangerous lab work. In 2005, there was a petition by some 700 scientists to Fauci, basically pleading with him, saying the things that you're funding are distorting our field. That because of the funding priorities of funding this kind of dangerous lab work, a new generation of so-called scientists were raised off this, cash trove to be doing this dangerous lab work. And I very much view this as, tied to the broader so-called war on terrorism and the so-called, perpetual wars, and now the war that we see against the Palestinians and targeting Lebanon, of course, and Iran, and so on and so forth. This is just simply another mechanism, another lever in the arsenal that the U.S. has. And I think it's part of the reason that I would really take issue with a lot of people who continuously say that the U.S. empire is, on the ropes, and and Iran's just about to win, and all of this. And I take a much more critical look at things like that, because I see all of the quivers that the U.S. empire has in its arsenal, including biowarfare. That's just one of them. Election manipulation, information manipulation. Look at all of the, what's been happening in Latin America as they flipped all of these governments, Colombia being the most recent. My work on all of the scientists. I basically investigated all of the scientists who most loudly proclaimed that COVID couldn't have had lab origins. And it's just you're turning over one rock after another. Another major pillar of propaganda, I talked about Robert Gary and Christian Anderson. They wrote this article that appeared in Nature Medicine, a very prestigious thing. The other major letter appeared in The Lancet. And the first signer of that was a man named Charles Kalischer at Colorado State University. Well, if you dig into him, the Cubans say that he was responsible for a dengue fever outbreak in 1981. He went to Cuba and he wanted to help advise the Cubans, telling them that, I see that you're sending troops to Angola to fight against the racist governments in South Africa and its allies. And eventually, some of the soldiers that you're sending over there, they're going to come back with dengue fever. And so I would advise you to stop sending soldiers to Angola to fight against these white supremacists. And lo and behold, there's a dengue fever outbreak, and there's numerous evidence for that as well. The nature of the outbreak, it broke out in different parts of Cuba simultaneously. There were actually double agents that said that they were told by their U.S. handlers to be on the lookout for dengue outbreaks and so on, that was actually planted by the U.S. as a form of biowarfare against Cuba, as basically a reprisal. They're basically running a mob operation to say, nice country. It would be a real shame if something happened to it if you don't obey orders.
Dan,
so this is just
Sam.
Aspect.
Yeah, I did want to go a little bit about the Ebola also, in that in 2014, one of the things that I found interesting was they gave us arguments like this was patient zero where it started. And as soon as you look into patient zero, they're like, yes, patient zero was probably wandering through the woods, playing with monkeys or eating monkeys or getting scratched by a monkey, maybe bitten, whatever, right? And when you look at patient zero was like 18 months old. And the parents were like, no, we would never let an 18-month-old child run through the jungles of Africa by themselves. When they make these arguments that even the layman who looks at it is going to say that doesn't make sense. And when people think about Ebola, but the type of Ebola that showed up in Africa in 2014 had been found in outbreaks 1,000 miles away. But it was also
Correct.
the same type of Ebola that was being studied at a U.S. lab 1,000 feet away. So it seems kind of, when you look at these kinds of things and you say, why is it that if the government wanted to know, that an independent journalist can look at these things in a matter of hours and say this doesn't make sense, but when you look at the government and they can't figure it out, it kind of implies that they can't figure it out because they don't want to figure it out.
Yeah, well, I mean, I had my suspicions, and other people had their suspicions at the time, besides the Africans who had their suspicions. But the article that I wrote a couple of years ago, it wasn't a solo effort. It was written with Jonathan Latham, who's a virologist, and what they basically did with the so-called patient zero was they found a child, little Emile, and he was in a village called Miliandu, and he was just over the border from Sierra Leone in Guinea, and they basically framed Guinea because they didn't want to say that the outbreak began in Sierra Leone, which is where the U.S. lab is. So they found a village just over the border. Now, when you go, when people finally went, like Chernobyl, an independent journalist, runs the Africanist Press, he and others, when they went there, found that his father and the healthcare workers didn't think that he had died of Ebola. They thought that he died of malaria. And they, if you really looked at the articles that claimed that he was patient zero, that they blared headlines calling him patient zero, but when you dug into the evidence that they presented, it wasn't there. For example, in all other Ebola outbreaks, there had been findings of Ebola in the animal reservoir in the area, for example, among monkeys, among bats, and so on. They actually claimed that he was playing with bats, but they didn't find any bats with Ebola in the village. And they claimed that what had happened was that there was a burnt out tree and that there were bats that had Ebola in this tree that got burnt out somehow, and that therefore that's why they couldn't find any Ebola. They couldn't find Ebola in the ape or primate reservoir in the area. Again, every other Ebola outbreak that was naturally occurring, they could find Ebola in the animal reservoir nearby. So if you actually looked at the specifics of the article that was published in 2014 to claim that this was patient zero, it just simply didn't add up. And one of the things that Jonathan really added to the article was he did an analysis of the genomic structure of the different outbreaks that happen in the different countries, and the predominance of the evidence was indicating that it really it originated in Sierra Leone, where the U.S. labs were, and not in neighboring Guinea, which is what the establishment narrative tried to portray things as. And we believe that this was part of a concerted effort in order to frame Guinea to avert people from the possibility of that. And so what you and people were just oblivious, ignoring what Africans were saying at the time. And it's amazing that it's still being ignored, including by people who point to COVID having lab origins, because a lot of these people are right wingers, and all they want to do is use it to bash China, right? Or they do some bashing of Fauci, but not the broader U.S. establishment structure of doing this dangerous lab work that is effectively biowarfare. If they were actually concerned. Sure.
Yeah, a quick question to break into you, because we've got a little bit of time, but I think it's important. You know, when I started studying COVID, I thought to myself, MERS, that was a coronavirus. You know, SARS, coronavirus, you know, some of these other coronaviruses, Middle East, MERS was Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome, you know, whatever. And I thought, perhaps we should look backwards, and these other coronaviruses this came from the lab, the odds are probably overwhelming that they did too. They plop up. And I think, like with MERS, some of them, they just killed so many people so fast that they couldn't spread in a nutshell. But when I look at that's why I want to get in contact with you when I see this Ebola thing now going on. This Ebola started spreading, and all of this fear of Ebola, you know, this discussion and fear of a spread of Ebola. I think to myself, in that there was evidence that was not looked into by the authorities, and that appeared to certainly indicate there was some chicanery going on here. I think it would be safe to assume that the same types of things can at least be suspected now, and that and what they did was, since people didn't know then, they don't know to look now. You know what I mean? And I think the Ebola outbreak now, that could be related, and some of these could be leaks, but some of these could be intentional to see what happens. Anyway, your thoughts on connecting the Ebola outbreak now to the previous suspicious outbreak, and again connecting COVID to SARS, to MERS, to previous coronavirus outbreaks.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the current outbreak should still be looked at skeptically. It is happening in an area where you have had outbreaks in the past, so it's possible that it is of natural origin, but it should still be scrutinized seriously. I should say, in terms of COVID, I've been very careful not to say lab leak because that implies accidental, and I don't know that. So I always say lab origin. It could have been a lab. It could be accidental, and it could be intentional, and it could be partly to frame China, or to have caused a cataclysmic effect in the global economy that put everybody on Zoom and destroyed tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of mom and pop businesses and so on. So I think we should be very, very skeptical of that. And I think that also informs, the current crisis with Iran, right? Everybody's saying that the U.S. doesn't want to crash the global economy. I don't know that parts of the U.S. establishment might want to jerk the global economy around in certain ways, as I think that we saw during the COVID outbreak. I think that serious questions need to be asked, and I don't think that we should come out with pat answers that just simply facilitate any particular party or political outcome or any particular nation. The people of the world have got to stand up to this kind of dangerous lab work that genuinely threatens humanity. And put it to a halt the same way that they need to stand up to Israel's genocide in Gaza and so on and so forth.
Well, I have a book sitting behind me right now called Bitten. And it is about what? It is about tick-related diseases, particularly Lyme disease.
Oh, yeah.
And how Lyme disease
is another.
There's significant evidence that certainly point to Lyme disease as having lab origin. In fact, the laboratory that was working on basically tick-borne diseases was like 12 to 15 miles from the first case of Lyme's disease, and the person who was working on that was asked to his death, well, were you behind Lyme's disease? And he wouldn't really answer. And it's fairly obvious at this point that there was tick-borne diseases being worked at a lab. And what do you know? A tick-borne disease shows up in and around the laboratory. And again, we cannot assume that these are accidents. We can assume maybe they're preparations. We don't know. Good.
Mm-hmm. Part of the origins of this are at the end of World War II, the U.S. basically integrated the Japanese unit, I believe it was 751, that did all of these horrific tests on people in China during World War II, and got that information and then used biowarfare in the Korean War, and then covered it up. One of the ways that they covered it up was Frank Olson was one of the scientists at Fort Detrick who was trying to blow the whistle on this. And the evidence is that they basically tossed him out of a window in New York City for it, and they tried to later come out with a half story, a limited hangout, claiming that it was an LSD experiment gone wrong, but in fact they were actually just trying to shut him up to make sure that he didn't spill the beans about the biowarfare. There's another interesting book called Baseless by Nicholson Baker, and the joke of that book is that the U.S. biowarfare program was called baseless, so that when the U.S. was accused at the UN of using biowarfare in the Korean War, the U.S. representative would stand up and say, "These are baseless charges," so that it was all this inside joke to the U.S. To the U.S. representatives, that they're using biowarfare and putting out these fake denials using the name of the program, thinking that it's totally baseless.
True? It's baseless. Yes,
so it was this tacit admission of their criminality. It just shows that there's no bottom
before we go,
to
Sam,
gravity.
Before we go, Sam, tell everybody where they can find your Substack, where they can find you online.
Absolutely. Husseini.substack.com. And I write about biowarfare stuff, and I also write about Gaza stuff, and I also try to write about really strategic things that people can do. I was a big proponent of using the Genocide Convention against Israel, voting strategies that can really move the needle by bringing populists from the left and right together. Things like that. So I hope people will tune into that. Husseini.substack.com.
Great. Sam Husseini, a great guy, man I've known for many years and a good friend. Sam, keep up the good work. My name's Garland Nixon, standing in for... Thank you. I'm Garland Nixon, standing in for the great George Galloway, and certainly appreciate everyone who's watching this show and who shares this stuff on all their social media platforms and who donates. We'll be right back. We're going to be taking your calls, and later on, we're going to have J Noh. He's a journalist, a writer, an educator, and he's going to connect Iran and the war on China and lots of other stuff. We'll be right back.
Situation in the Gulf is perfectly simple. A Faustian pact has been reached by utterly unrepresentative family dictatorships and the United States of America, which has gradually, and to a greater extent in some of them than in others, forced them to come to terms with Israel and to abandon what they previously saw as their Arab and Islamic dignity in maintaining at least rhetorical attachment to the Palestinian people and their cause. And so now there are two masters. There's the American master and the Israeli master. And whilst almost always they are in tandem, they are not entirely always in tandem. So, for example, Saudi Arabia would not join the Abraham Accords. It would not normalize its relationship with Israel, even though, of course, covertly, under the table, they had relations. They would never publicly renounce the Palestinian cause in the way that these other Arab slave governments have done. And they wouldn't join the accord, they wouldn't afford recognition, they wouldn't normalize their relationship. And the price that they've paid is a protection racket price. It's literally a protection packet. Although, as I always say, at least when you pay the Genovese family in New York for protection, after a fashion, they will give you protection. If somebody trashes your business or some freelance thief wants to rob from you, the mob, the mafia, will impose themselves on you, on them, and will ask you for a higher premium in future. But Trump hasn't even done that. He literally abandoned the people that have been paying him and his country a king's ransom and more for decades.
You are listening to the Mother of All Talk Shows with George Galloway.
Hello, Garland Nixon here. I am back standing in for the great George Galloway on the Mother of All Talk Shows. George will be back on Sunday, and I'm privileged to be sitting in his seat, though I'll never fill his shoes. All right. Hey, how about we got a poll going on, and the poll says, is Israel deliberately targeting Palestinian children? Telegram, 99% say yes, 1% say no. X, 90% say yes, 10% says no. YouTube, we got 95 to 5, and Patreon, YouTube stream 98 to 2, and Patreon is where it's all about. Patreon, 100% yes, 0% no. Let's go to the lines. We got Chris, Burton upon Trent, wants to talk about the defense budget. Gee, Chris, you want to spend money on food and education and crazy things like that when we could be blowing things up? Chris, you're on.
Lovely to be on talking to you, Garland. I also watch your other show. I was introduced to you last time you were on George Galloway's show, standing in, so salute to you, sir. Yes, I do want to talk about NATO, the unelected Mark Rutte on his European campaign to get us all to stop spending money on welfare. So no more, as you say, schools, roads, buses, anything to help the working class out. That's all ending to buy bombs. So I think that's really, really bad. My solution to that, though, Garland, is let's not cut the welfare. How's about we don't borrow the money? How's about we actually just tax the billionaires? And if we do tax the billionaires, like Elon Musk and those sort of people, I don't think there'll be a war coming. I think they'll soon change their mind on that one. Mainly, what I want to speak about with you, Garland, is this, you've got Elon Musk platforming this film with Armie Hammer, this citizen journalist film, and just sort of the hypocrisy of this fascist movement, blaming all the migrants and brown people for sort of any sexual assaults or, sort of any rapes against women. So Armie Hammer, who's actually the lead actor in this film, I don't know if you're aware, he was actually accused himself of rape, cannibalism, and all sorts of bad things towards women a couple of years ago. Well, that's sort of getting nowhere, sort of, in the media whatsoever. And I just think it's terrible how Elon Musk can platform for that film when that film has actually been banned in Germany.
Well, Chris, one of the things that I find suspicious, I'm watching the news, and a couple of months ago, I'm watching in Belfast in Ireland, people are in the streets and they were angry over the issues of gas prices going up and things of that nature. They were angry. They're furious. They're rioting in the streets over, the conditions that they were living as a result of the leadership, right? And then a month or two later, I look and they're in the streets and now it's all about immigrants. Oh, they're furious about immigrants. And I'm thinking, okay, the people are in the streets and they're angry at the ruling class. And then somehow it's almost like someone took control of these protests. As we've seen in so many color revolution instances, right? There will be legitimate protests, and in come the intelligence agencies. They take control of a legitimate protest and then they'll turn it into whatever they want, regime change. In my opinion, it certainly seems suspicious. And it seems maybe one could even argue likely that there were already legitimate protest against the ruling class, and they just come in and say, no, why would you protest against us when there's immigrants? You could go in their houses, you could drag them in the street, beat them and burn things, and now you have people, not that it's not legitimate to argue that there is an immigration issue. That's a legitimate intellectual political, philosophical discussion, and there's nothing wrong with having that discussion. But I feel like when I see people protesting against the ruling class policies, and then the next thing you know, the same people are in the streets and now they're burning the houses of immigrants, I feel like that is some kind of a color revolution commandeerment of legitimate protest, as they tend to do. Your thoughts?
They're just totally artificial. And I just don't think that the media, especially the media, I don't think it educates the people as it should. If you watch Sky News, you'll probably think that all those protests and all these riots by Tommy Robinson, they are actually legitimate, because all you're seeing is people arriving on boats from aboard with all our main politicians complaining against it. No one's actually saying what's behind the migrants. Why are the migrants coming to us? And the sort of money that is behind that.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that is the issue of migration. What is driving it? They destroy the entire regions that they live in. They destabilize regions, and then migrants come, and of course they use them for cheaper labor. In fact, everyone out there, you can look this up. There's an infamous conversation between Muammar Gaddafi and Tony Blair, in which Muammar Gaddafi was discussing with Tony Blair, saying, look, you know that my country is a block that a lot of poor people from poor regions that were being preyed upon by the British imperialism, by the way, but and others, French, etc. But a lot of these people in these regions would like to come through Libya, and they'll come straight across the channel, and boom, they'll flood it. And then if you overthrow my country, it's going to go bad. And guess what? They did it anyway. So they were warned what would happen. They knew it would happen, and they did it anyway, which implies that they wanted a flood of migrants, that this was the intent. And now people are taught to be infuriated at the migrants and not to the people who deliberately flooded the place with migrants. We got to get ready to run, but you get one last word in.
Totally, exactly. It seems that they've got it both ways. They've got the license to go out to go abroad to faraway lands, disrupt those countries, and then when the blowback comes here, get away with it, it seems, twice. My final thoughts are, are we now seeing those sort of colour revolutions happening here? Are they sort of disrupting society over here like they have done abroad in the past?
Yeah, thank you very much, Chris. And if we push back too much, will we have an earthquake too? Will we be the one that gets the next HAARP-inspired earthquake too? There's certainly questions there. Moat's big donors tonight. Now another big shout out to more of tonight's top Moat supporters: Elizabeth Morley, Stephen Sims, Carol Kelly, Monica Macias, and James Glass. Thank you for backing the program through Moats.tv and helping keep the show independent, strong, and on air. You can support Moats too. Visit Moats.tv, click the Donate Now button, and give whatever you can afford in any currency. One-off donations are welcome, while recurring support every week, month, quarter, or year makes an even bigger difference. All right, and everyone out there, for those of you, if you're not Garland Nixon YouTube, make sure you follow me. I'm on YouTube all the time, have a lot of great and fun shows, and I am very, very proud to be a part of the Mother of All Talkshows, and very proud to have a guy who I've been working with for years, who does fantastic work on peace. He's a journalist, he's a writer, he's an educator, and his name is J Noh. KJ, welcome.
A pleasure to be with you, Garland.
Always a pleasure, KJ. A man who I respect. Thank you very much. Always a pleasure, KJ. A man who I respect a lot, who has tremendous knowledge and historical knowledge, particularly of things in Asia. Now, let's start here. I think that in order to discuss what's happening, even Ukraine, but in order to discuss what's happening in the Straits of Hormuz, what's happening in West Asia, it has to be connected to the worldwide war on China. That, what happened? They start off, okay, we're going to attack Iran, and it's the protesters and the nuclear weapons or whatever else we can come up with, fine, all a bunch of lies. And then all of a sudden, we'll just blockade oil tankers going to China. It's, a lot of people don't want to accept this, but they have told us that it's ultimately all about China, and that is my belief. I'm not to belittle what's going on and the importance of it and the criticality of standing up for the rights of the people in Iran and stopping these brutal wars and attacks. But we have to understand the big picture, and I'd like to ask you your thoughts on that, KJ Noh.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Garland. You know, the big picture is that this is about U.S. Aspirations for maintaining global hegemony. It wants to be the boss of the world, and that involves taking down China. And originally, both Russia and Iran were supposed to be like side dishes, appetizers. That is to say, the US would knock off Russia as an appetizer. The main dish was China, and then it would knock off Iran as kind of dessert. It didn't turn out that way. The sequencing got jumbled, and the appetizer that Russia was supposed to be a drive-by. That is to say, you know, it's a gas station with pretensions. You know, how could the US not just, you know, cakewalk over it? But it didn't turn out that way. It turned out into a protracted battle. And so now it's stuck both in Europe and in West Asia, and it doesn't quite know what to do. But it is still continuing to escalate and is still continuing to prepare for war against China, as we can see as what is happening both with Japan, with Korea, the Philippines, Australia, and the entire gamut of continued information warfare, hybrid warfare against China, both inside China, in the United States, and all along the periphery of China.
You know, one of the interesting things is Australia. The Australians are being told that they have to be prepared to protect their country from their number one trading partner, from the country that makes them wealthy and gives them a pretty good life. And that they have to get these nuclear submarines and the whole AUKUS thing, which seems to be falling apart. And what's the latest on this whole Australia thing, wherein Australia is trying to be set up to be like a nuclear submarine base, and which seems to be falling apart. But what's the latest on this attempt to weaponize Australia against China?
Well, Australia is very, very important because first, it has always served as a U.S. subcontractor for U.S. wars or Western imperial wars, going all the way back to Gallipoli, but also World War II. In the Korean War, there was significant presence, there's significant force multiplier for the U.S. During the Vietnam War, they were there. During Afghanistan, we know that the U.S. Used Australian troops as shock troops. You know, they were caught out, slicing the throats of, young children just for sport, what they referred to as blooding. It was a kind of an initiation ritual for their own special forces. So Australia has always been this quisling subcontractor to U.S. militarism. And in this escalating war against China, it is also being recruited to serve that same role, which is not to say that this is what the Australian people want or that there aren't parties that are strongly opposed to this. But the leading, ruling parties are pretty much in bed with the United States. And these structures have been put in place over decades now, very, very hard to dismantle. But one of the ideas is that they were going to use Perth, the naval base Perth, as kind of the rear base from which to make sure that they could exert pressure against China. If you look at the Pacific, there's a kind of it's what they call the Quad, but there is a kind of four-poster strategy, battle strategy, which involves the first island chain, that is Korea and Taiwan Island and Okinawa Islands, and then going all the way to Borneo, Philippines, Indonesia, etc. So that is the kind of initial cordon sanitaire with which they've created a wall of missiles with which to box in China and to obliterate it. And as we speak, the US is rehearsing with Japan an island hopping strategy, which would be to move from island to island and continually shoot and scoot, fire standoff missiles against China. Their theory is that if we can move quickly enough and continue to attack China, we will be able to devastate it with our doctrine of war, which is called air-sea battle. But if you look at this formulation that they call the Quad, this involves the United States, Japan, Australia, and the UK.
Was India? UK, okay.
India. AUKUS. AUKUS involves
India
the UK, US,
yes,
and Australia. Yes. So the Quad blocks off the four quadrants. India is the left tackle. Japan is the right tackle. Australia is kind of the rear defense, and then the front line is Taiwan and Korea, etc. Okay, so this is well blocked out, and then you also have AUKUS, Australia, UK, US alliance, and this was presented as some kind of a contract to acquire nuclear submarines. Turns out that they're not going to get those nuclear submarines, if at all. If at best they're going to get like second generation washed out things. And it has nothing to do with the actual submarine contracts, because Australia doesn't face any risks from China. China is not going to, be mining Australia's harbors. And essentially, as you point out, China, Australia's greatest trade partner is China. Australia's wealth is dependent on trade with China. And any trade that goes back and forth, if they need to, protect those waterways, they don't need to protect them against China, because they're going to China or coming from China. So it's absolute nonsense. But what AUKUS is essentially a basing agreement combined with weapons contracts that locks the United States, that locks Australia even more deeply inside the US military embrace. So all of this is happening almost on autopilot. And although Australia has, vacillated back and forth, played Jekyll and Hyde with China, essentially the momentum is for Australia to continue to be militarized as a platform for projecting war against China.
Now, interestingly enough, Korea, I think they've got some stumbling blocks in Korea, more so than some other places, in that they attempted with the latest, the previous leader of Korea, they attempted a violent coup to return to military dictatorship, and the people were able to stand up and fight that off. And in fact, the guy got, I think, life in prison. What's the current? I know there were problems with the U.S. empire in Korea. I also know that the U.S. empire literally, in the instance of war, takes full control. Most people don't know this. If there is a war, the United States then takes total control of the South Korean military. It completely becomes part of the U.S. military. But what is the status of Korea right now, and the ability of it to push back against the U.S. empire?
It's a little bit of a minefield, very, very tricky. So you're absolutely correct. The previous president, his name was Yoon Suk-yeol, was a complete and total U.S. Quisling proxy. He was Mr. American Pie. He was giving the U.S. everything they wanted, including a war on the peninsula that would justify the U.S. taking control over South Korea's military, which it does under conditions of wartime OPCON. That is to say, South Korea is unique in all the quote-unquote sovereign countries on the planet that its military is under the control of the United States. It has a 500,000-man army, 3.1 million reserve troops. All of these troops fall immediately under U.S. control. At the drop of a hat, the moment the U.S. says two magic words, DEFCON 3. If it says DEFCON 3, everything that is yours is mine now. And so the ostensible pretext is that it can only be exercised under conditions of war. It's kind of a nonsense, tautology, because the only time control of a military matters is when they are at war. It's like the only time you need to steer a car is when it's moving on the streets, right? Not in the garage. But anyway, the U.S. claims that it has wartime operational control. The thing is, so it's like an eminent domain, and it can get it anytime it wants, but it ostensibly needs a pretext. It needs the pretext of war. And that was what Yoon Suk-yeol, the former U.S. Quisling South Korean president, was supposed to provide with his martial law declaration. Because as he declared martial law, just prior to that, he had launched scores of attacks on North Korea, hoping that they would retaliate and that this would give him, the pretext, the ostensible pretext for martial law. Well, it's interestingly, the North Koreans didn't respond. They were very, very chill because, they didn't want to get pulled into a war. And then so Yoon Suk-yeol just went ahead and declared martial law anyway. And part of the plan was to kill off South Korean legislators and claim that North Korean spies and commandos had done this, etc. All of this unraveled because essentially the moment he declared martial law, the South Koreans, he declared martial law, I think it was on a Monday night around 11 p.m. And the South Koreans came out in their pajamas and they surrounded the national legislature and they fought hand to hand, with special forces troops and essentially, defeated them. People who were doing deliveries at the time, these are the people out on the streets, delivery drivers ditched their deliveries and went straight to the National Assembly to resist the martial law troops. People in chemotherapy, tore off their chemotherapy and rushed to, the National Assembly. So the Koreans, were very, very, South Koreans were very, very, upset about this. And because of that, they were able to thwart this declaration of martial law, which would have turned Korea back into a police state, which it was for at least half of its history, and under U.S. control. So that was thwarted. And so then we had an election, and Yoon Suk-yeol, the former president, was arrested. He's currently in prison, facing at least a life sentence plus other charges. And a progressive was elected by the name of Lee Jae-myung. Now, Lee Jae-myung is really interesting because he comes from the progressive wing of South Korean politics, but more importantly, he himself was a child worker. Starting from the age of 12, he worked in factories. So he is a man of the common people. He says that every day I would go into a factory and I would be beaten within inches of my life, just for the privilege of, working. So he knows a thing or two about, what the Korean dictatorship is capable of. And he also, is a man of the people. And one of the things that he wants to do is he wants to wrest back South Korean sovereignty from the U.S. And the first step in this is he needs to wrest back OPCON, or operational control of South Korean troops. South Korea wants control of its troops back. And the U.S. National Defense Authorization Act has just passed a law saying that OPCON essentially will not be returned to Koreans. They're essentially saying that, it prohibits a reduction in U.S. military posture on the Korean Peninsula, and that any change has to be, dependent on, very specific risk assessment, and that there will be no return of OPCON. And it actually directs efforts to enhance U.S. and Republic of Korea operational capabilities and interoperabilities. So essentially, the U.S. is saying, no, F you. You are not going to be able to get your own military back. Javier Burnham is the CFC commander. He's a 3-star general who currently controls the U.S. military, U.S. Forces Korea, but also would control South Korean troops. And again, he has said to the president, you're not going to get OPCON back. We're not going to, essentially saying, go F yourself, to the president of South Korea. And he's also pointed out that South Korea is critical in war against China because, as he pointed out in his own words, it is inside China's defense perimeter. It's essentially, he's pointed out that China is playing a defensive game and that it is already on the Asian continent right next to China, which is why South Korea is so important. So yes, the US is definitely seeking to use Korea as the kind of spear point against China, along with Taiwan, along with Japan, along with Philippines. But also more specifically, the US is not happy with the South Korean President Lee Jae-myung. They have said no to his request for return of OPCON, and they have sent in, I think her name is Michelle Lee. They've appointed this new ambassador who is extreme far right, who was accused President Lee Jae-myung of being in the Chinese pocket and a communist. And we generally refer to these types of ambassadors as regime change ambassadors. These are ambassadors.
Well, we got to get ready to run. We're going to have to get ready to run, KJ. We're getting close up to the hour. Where can people find you online?
They can find me, of course, on Moats, on your show, on Danny Haifeng, on good progressive channels. And then I've very recently written a book with Finian Cunningham called Killing Democracy. Daniel Kovalik, myself, Finian Cunningham, etc. We worked on this book together, Jeremy Kuzmarov.
Well, keep up the good work. All good friends of mine and great people. Thank you very much, KJ Noh. My name's Garland Nixon. We'll talk to you again soon. Garland Nixon here, standing in for George Galloway on the Mother of All Talkshows. You can download the Moats podcast right now by scanning the QR code on your screen. You can listen to the weekly podcast at moats.tv. And once you listen, please don't forget to leave a review and rate the podcast. It helps the program grow and it helps more people discover it around the world. This week, the podcast, listen to this, check this out, is in the top 10 for politics in Botswana, Liberia, Cyprus, Nigeria, Mauritius, and in the top 30 for politics in Bulgaria, South Africa, Chile, and Malaysia. So, hey, when you call in and you're a part of the show, when you comment and we read your comment, people all over the world are getting to hear your input, like Freya, for instance, today, and May in Oklahoma. So certainly you could call in, be a part of the Moats family. Let's see. Well, we've got enough time for, I think we can take a call. Can we? Do we? David in California. David, you got a minute.
How you doing? Man, I've been trying to get a hold of you forever. I'm a longshoreman whose dad was a cop.
Oh, my gosh, and I'm a retired cop whose dad was a longshoreman.
Oh, this is my comment. This is from the issue you did before. Now, the war with Europe and Russia, war has been going on for centuries. That war is basically the Slavs and the Saxons. It's a Saxon-Slav war that's been going on since Napoleon. It's been going on since the Ukrainian War, the Crimean War. It's been going on since World War I, World War II. It's all the same war.
Yeah, it's and it's what KJ was talking about too. It's the war of domination. It's the discussion. It's the Mackinder discussion about the Eurasian continent, and whoever controls that controls the world. And it's a belief, way back by the British Empire and today, that the Russian homeland has a lot of natural resources. It has a great strategic value worldwide. It has a European coast and Black Sea coast and, Pacific coast, etc., and European border, I mean. But whatever the case, it is the value of Russia for the imperialists, for the colonialists, for the mad warmongers. As long as Russia stays where it is, unless it moves, they're going to be after Russia. But, I got a funny feeling they're not going to get it. And in this instance, I'll make another argument. It is possible that maybe they're not quite seeking a war and confrontation with Russia. It seems likely they are, but I got to throw one other possibility, and that is that they're trying to bait Russia to attack, strike, hit someplace, so then they can freak out and they can turn up the sanctions regime to 1,000,000%. That's my thoughts. But thank you very much. Certainly appreciate David in California. All right. Guess what? We have some comments, and let's look and see what we got. We got Coffee 23. I just realized that Sam, speaking of Sam Husseini, is the guy who got thrown out of Blinken's press conference. Sam's a legend. Yes, you're nobody till you get thrown out of a press conference, right? Well, actually, yes. And Tony Blinken, for those of who don't know his connection to the Epstein class, his stepfather was a guy named Samuel Pisar. He was a lawyer, and he was the lawyer for Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell's father. That's Tony Blinken. You're never more than a hop, skip, and a jump. Only a hop most of the time from the Epstein class with these people. Duck Miller says, Garland knows how to crank it up a notch sitting in for Gigi, and his show is more measured and homey. I'm not sure what measured in homey means, but whatever it is, I'm more, and that's great. Bill Gates, according to Nikia 6571, the walking, talking STD, has the cheek to lecture African countries about reproductive health. Yeah, that's a good one. How about we go with 562, says, my oldest brother is an ICU physician. During the height of COVID, one of his cancer patients died from cancer, but the hospital changed the cause of death to COVID. After that, my brother quit. Yes, that's right. There was that discussion. And Fauci, Dr. Fauci even admitted it, died from COVID versus died with COVID. And speaking of physicians, don't forget the great Ranjit Brar, a man who really does good work. And right now, we must all support him as he's being harassed by the powers that be over his support for the people of Gaza and for justice. How about Mark Ballmer says, don't forget how settling America became a biological weapon for the natives who lacked immunity to European diseases. Yes, and blankets with smallpox. It wasn't just that diseases didn't just always happen to find their way into the Native American communities. They were oftentimes deliberately put there. How about we go with Colin J58, who says, most of us in Australia do not want any war with China. We all love China. We travel there. We trade with them and have done for over 40 years. The person who lives next door to me is from China, nice people. Well, it's like Paul Robeson, the great Paul Robeson said, if the American people are asked, they don't want war with the Soviet Union or Russia or anyone else, right? The people don't want war. There are no limits of quotes about the people that don't want war. But the lowlifes that run things do want war. So we've got to band together and we've got to fight it and we've got to stop it. Tom McTeague says, this is our final call, our final comment, Tom. So we're going out with you. And meanwhile, Google says that China has built 257 kilometers of high-speed rail with all the infrastructure to run it in the last 120 days. Maybe if we ask nicely, they'll help us with our railroads again. Well, you know what? Since the U.S. is threatening and the Europeans are threatening to take China out, I kind of got a feeling they're going to withhold the goods that we need to attack them with. What was it Lenin said about the capitalists? They'll sell you the rope to use to hang them with. The Chinese are going to do that. All right. Well, it's been another wonderful show. My name's Garland Nixon, and I'm standing in for the great George Galloway. He'll be back on Sunday, and we're going to have another great show. I want to thanks to all my guests, and share this on all your social media platforms. We're out.